Through their housing fund, Amazon is creating and preserving affordable homes with 99-year affordability commitments, so families can live in the communities where they work for generations to come.
At Amazon, we believe everyone should have access to a home they can afford, and we're partnering locally to help make that possible.
Support from partners like Amazon help us continue advancing projects that are grounded in our community priorities.
Amazon, proud supporter of local communities like yours.
And now, the Cascade PBS Ideas Festival, featuring journalists and newsmakers from around the country in conversation about the issues making headlines. Thank you for joining us for Fresh Air with Eddie S. Glaude Jr., moderated by Tonya Mosley. Before we begin, a special thank you to our members. We'd also like to thank our premier event sponsors, Amazon and HX Expeditions, our founding sponsor, the Carrie and Linda Killinger Foundation, our session sponsor, Socius Law, and our host venue, Fremont Studios.
Welcome to the Cascade PBS Ideas Festival. I am Tonya Mosley, and it is my honor and pleasure to be in conversation with Eddie Glaude Jr. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I am so honored to be in conversation with you, and I think a great way to start is to actually have you read a passage from the book. I want to tell you guys the name of the book is America USA, How Race Shadows the Nation's Anniversary. And let's start with the very first page.
Sure. But before I start reading, I want to just say how honored I am to be in conversation with you, to have an opportunity to talk about this book in this moment with you is so meaningful to me. So here it is. Bitterness at the bottom of the cup. I do not love America and never have, especially now. It seems to me misplaced or dangerous to love something so abstract and so morally dubious. Love is most often felt and experienced close to the ground, in the life lived in a particular place and time, and in memories that take up residence in the heart. I suspect love of country is shorthand for the heartfelt relationships and experiences that make us who we are, things that happen in the place we call home, no matter how complicated that place may be. James Baldwin was right. Whoever's part of whatever civilization helplessly loves some aspects of it and some of the people in it. And I suppose that is why, in part, we are willing to risk our lives in defense of this place and of what it might become. But in America, those feelings and experiences have always been stained by the ugliness of what white people believe about color. That somehow or in some inscrutable way, the color of one's skin determines your value. You end up spending much of your life trying to prove to others and to yourself, not because you are obsessed with white people, but because you want to live, that you are not an N-word. Some Americans may believe that this view is a relic of a past that we have long left behind. After all, they might say, we elected a black president and vice president. Look how far we've come. Stop complaining, I hear them say. You teach at Princeton University. You are not a victim. But I speak from the experience of a life lived in this country, and I trust what I know, what I've seen, and what now sits in the pit of my stomach.
When did that sentence, I do not love America, become true to you? When did you consciously realize that that was a truth for you?
I had written some version of the introduction, and it didn't land. I thought I was holding something back. And so, writing is mostly about revision. And so I returned to that first paragraph, and suddenly this sentence just came on the page. And I got up and I started walking. around my study. And I was afraid of what this would mean if I left it there. And then almost as if, something inside of my head just simply said, but this is what you have to say. You have to begin here, and then you can explain it. So I left it there. And I decided, in this time, you have to be courageous and vulnerable and daring. And I couldn't.
And truthful.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the things that struck me from the very beginning of this book was that I realized I wasn't reading from the same man who wrote Begin Again. Because in Begin Again, which is a previous book of yours, you use James Baldwin's work to kind of beat back despair. And in this book in particular, I felt that optimism of a truth teller, of a freedom fighter, it was gone.
Yeah.
Am I right in that feeling? In the same way that Langston Hughes, we felt in his later writings, and in James Baldwin.
Yeah, so in so many ways, I'm arguing with Jimmy. In Notes of a Native Son, Baldwin says, I love my country more than anything, and it's because of that love, I reserve the right to criticize it relentlessly, to paraphrase him. I never begin there. I didn't begin there. Maybe it's because I'm from Mississippi, But I'm rageful. There are moments when I'm battling depression because the country has done this again. At the end of Begin Again, I said, well, we have to make a choice, right? Will we do this or that? And we have a choice to put this moment behind us, and look what we did. And now people have to raise their children in the midst of this. They've gutted the Voting Rights Act. They're redrawing districts. We're in the midst of what could very well be described as a second redemption, a second lost cause. And the last sentence of the book speaks that emotion. And so what I was trying to do with this book was kind of write myself some security underneath my feet, right? So that I could actually get this rage under control, to get my sadness, my melancholia under control.
Why anniversaries is a way to look at this country's relationship with race? You could have chosen court cases. You could have chosen lots of different ways. What is it about our nation's anniversaries that allow us to see the problem so clearly?
So at each of these moments, the country has to tell a story about itself. It has to tell a story about its founding. And so here we are in the 250th, and look at the contours of the story. Just don't look at the UFC arena or the Great American Fair or the Garden of Statues of Heroes. But they're going to tell a story. It's going to be a particular story. We're the greatest nation in the history of the world. It's going to be a story about the saintliness of the founders, a story about the sacredness of this grand experiment. And each of these anniversaries, the nation has to tell a story about itself, about its founding. And in each of these moments, Tonya, the country is struggling and grappling with its contradiction. In each of these moments, the divided soul of the nation is in full view. Right? Du Bois in 1903 wrote The Souls of Black Folk. And in The Souls of Black Folk, he says that Black folk see themselves through the eyes of those who despise them. This is what he called double consciousness. But I believe that double consciousness is actually a consequence of the double consciousness of the nation. That America imagines itself at once as a beacon of freedom and as a white republic. And to hold those two things together you can't really without contradiction. And it deposits a kind of madness at the heart of the country. And we see it evidenced every single milestone anniversary. 1876, 1926, 1976, and by God, 250 years later, 2026.
Initially I was using the word rhyme to describe the different anniversaries. But there's something underneath that, a deeper layer that you call disremembering.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what that is, that disremembering, and why it's so important for us to continue to talk about it when we're talking about history and our place in it?
Yeah, disremembering, I get from Toni Morrison.
Yes.
And, you know, she takes this notion of remembering and dismembering, the violence of forgetting. Morrison is very clear about the work that disremembering is doing for the nation. Right? It releases it of its sins, it absolves it, right, of its evils. And so we tell ourselves this story in order to secure our innocence. And what we choose, and I write about this in Democracy in Black, what we choose and who we choose to forget actually reveals the limits of our conceptions of justice. Mm. And so the disremembering is doing violence as it protects our innocence as a nation.
I want to spend some real time on two of the anniversaries that sit on top of each other. So 1876 and 1976, because the disremembering of the two, I feel like is so potent. It tells us so much. So 1876 is where you note that racial justice starts to get treated as philanthropy.
Yeah.
It's a gift that white people can extend and also withdraw rather than something that is owed. Can you talk more about that and why this reframe of understanding this is so important as we read through your book and your ideas?
Yeah, well, I'm trying to figure out this cycle. Why is it that we're always returning to this? What's going on? And one of the ways I've resolved it is that, or I haven't resolved the cycle of the way in which I describe it, is, okay, if America imagines itself as a beacon of freedom and as a white republic, and if you can't hold those things without contradiction, how do you finesse it? Well, you finesse it by assuming that white people possess freedom to give and to take away. Oh, let me be clear now before people get uncomfortable. When I say white people, I'm talking at a certain level of generality. This is me, my reading of James Baldwin. Baldwin will say, I happen to love, and I say this, I happen to love a lot of people who happen to be white, and then they're white people. You figure out which one you are. No, I'm just kidding. But the point is that we all bear the burden of racialization. We're all socialized in this way in which these categories matter to how we see ourselves and understand ourselves. But then there are folk who are invested in the hierarchy and the way in which it distributes benefit and burden. So that's why I say I happen to love a lot of people who happen to be white, and then they're white folk, right? So those people believe that they possess freedom to give and to take away. And so what we see is anti-slavery movement, right? Folk are fighting against slavery, and they are arguing that this contradicts their commitment to principles of equality and liberty and democracy and the like. And then once the Civil War amendments are passed, particularly the one that ends slavery, the 13th Amendment, what do we get? This debate about whether or not these folk can bear the burden and responsibility of citizenship. So you see folk who were once, right, anti-slavery suddenly become, right, folk who are arguing against extending citizenship to black folk, right? So 1876 is this moment. Frederick Douglass is grappling with this. He's an example of these freedom snatchers, these people who believe that they can give freedom and to take away. He was born in slavery. He escaped. He witnessed Lincoln sign the Emancipation Proclamation, the ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and he lived long enough to see Jim Crow. Mm-hmm. He called these folk the apostles of forgetfulness, right? Mm-hmm. And then he would say, and he said in 1875, I don't want your alms, I want justice. Hmm. He's skeptical of people who want to do something for us as opposed to with us. Huh? And so 1876 is this extraordinary moment, Tonya, when the country engages for the first time after the carnage of the Civil War in a national remembrance of its founding, and it engages in this horrific act at scale of disremembering. Mm-hmm. Frederick Douglass was actually invited to be on the dais with President Grant. He's trying to get in. This is in Philadelphia, not in Philadelphia, Mississippi, but Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Yes.
He's trying to get in. He shows the Philadelphia police officer his ticket, which puts him on the dais. The officer says there's no way an N-word should be on the dais with President Grant. He would not allow him in. If it wasn't for a senator who sees him, Senator Conklin, I believe, who sees him and then escorts him in, Frederick Douglass would not have been able to even enter the exposition. Then they sit him on the stage, the most famous orator in the United States at the time. They sit him on the stage and he cannot say a word. He's just there, silent. Silent. So there's this disremembering that's happening as the country barrels towards the end of the 19th century, with the violence of Colfax, the violence of Vicksburg, the violence of Hamburg, South Carolina, the violence of these coups that are taking place, political coups that are taking place in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia against the backdrop of the horror that will leave over 53,000 Black people dead by the end of the 19th century. The country tells itself a story about the grandness of the American project. My.
I'm just so struck by this idea of it being a philanthropic effort as we bring parallels to today. In particular, I'm thinking about 2020, when we all seem to be coming to this same realization in the same way that we found during Reconstruction, where, oh, we understand the ills, we want to right the wrongs, and the white allies are in our corner and they believe us and they're speaking truth to power as well. And then something happens, like the idea of it being a philanthropic effort, this idea that you can put it on the shelf and then you can take it off the shelf when it comes to racial equality.
At the heart of this idea that certain people think that they possess freedom to give and to take away is the cycle of sentimentality and rage. You cry your crocodile tears. I remember writing this passage, trying to figure it out. Just 5 years ago, 6 years ago, we were in the midst of a racial reckoning. I was crying on national television about George Floyd and the like. And in the blink of an eye, we're here. In the blink of an eye. And the only thing I could conclude is that people were lying. You weren't telling the truth. Or you didn't have anywhere else to land. And you just returned to the status quo. And so I was trying to describe it in a way, drawing on Baldwin's notion of sentimentality and Oscar Wilde and others, right? That sentimentality is really just, about your own individual feelings. Baldwin says it's the mask of cruelty, right? You cry your crocodile tears for us. Oh, we're going to do this for you. We're going to make sure we're going to absolve ourselves of our sins by actually engaging in this effort. We're going to tell the truth about what we've done. And then when the people who bear the brunt of what we've done continue to ask for justice, then the question becomes, what else do you want? We've given you enough. Overreach. How much more are you going to ask? And as soon as you hear those questions, we're on the cusp of the backlash, the rage. And here we are.
What were some of the challenges for you as you were putting these things together? Or maybe some of the big surprises for you? Because I know that, you started to see this disremembering, this continuing with every anniversary and every 50 years.
There are these moments when I'm particularly in 1926 and I'm looking at the sesquicentennial or the 150th, and, there's this moment where, we think of the 1920s, the roaring 20s, right? But it's really the decade of the Klan. The most important piece of legislation that the Klan claimed as its seminal achievement is the Immigration Nationality Act of 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act, which current folk are trying to return us to. This is really important. Or the fact that the Klan was approved initially to have its annual convention on the grounds of the 1926 celebration of the nation's founding. They were going to celebrate the flag and burn a cross at the same time. Can you imagine?
I think I want to take us now to 1976, because this is a time period where you and I are alive, we're coming of age. How old were you in 1976?
8.
You were 8 years old. Yeah, it's the bicentennial. And the question has shifted by then. This is the apex of white flight, the thick of desegregation fights. Yeah. And it's the first time, as you write in your book, that the nation is forced to kind of acknowledge Black history. But the question isn't whether Black freedom should be retracted, it's whether we should participate at all in the bicentennial. Yeah. Can you talk briefly about that?
Sure. You know, it's just, I remember I have a photo. I have a vague memory of me being in red, white, and blue pants. How kitschy the 76 bicentennial celebration was, you know, from red, white, and blue whoopee cushions to a range of things. But this is a celebration really of white ethnics in 1976. Remember 1926, there is this real intense debate around immigration.
And this is such an interesting point in history, because this is where immigrants have the ability to become white. Yes. They have a choice to make. Yes. And as Black people, we sit very squarely in that because we're representative of what?
The journey of the country itself,
yes.
Right? But, you know, 1926, these white, you know, if you're from Italy, you're from Ireland, you're Jewish, you're from the swarthy part, the S-hole countries of Europe, right? The Klan can't stand. Mm-hmm. They are as much against Irish Catholicism in particular, as they are against Black people in the 1920s. But by 1976, their children are claiming the revolution as their own. Mm-hmm. Black folk are still arguing. We're in this moment of deep dissensus, Tonya. Mm-hmm. Watergate, Vietnam, Black Power, the Black student, SDS. There's all of this deep suspicion and skepticism about the country. And so the bicentennial is supposed to be this ritual that's going to bring us together over and against all of this conflict and discord that's defined the decade of the 60s and the early part of the 70s. And it's just the first year, because in 1926 is the first time Negro History Week is celebrated in 1926. 1976, Negro History Week becomes Black History Month. Mm-hmm. President Ford, I can't believe I just mentioned him.
Yeah.
President Ford recognizes and acknowledges Negro History Week and then Black History Month. But there's this debate, because Black folk are still struggling. Ought we to celebrate this? Because what's happening is that instead of disappearing Black history is being absorbed into the story of America to affirm America's inherent goodness.
Look, I only have 5 more minutes with you, so, okay. So you write about the Reagan years. Reagan signs the ML holiday into law.
Yeah.
This is the time period where we start talking about, like, color blindness. Yeah. It's a sorting. It parts Black history to fit into this fairy tale, but we're still kind of off to the side. It's not integrated into the full story. Why does this move matter so much? Because I think about the moment that we're in now, and I think about what we just went through in 2020. It was the breaking apart of that colorblind idea.
What makes this moment so crazy is that they don't even accept the redacted version of our story. Mm-hmm. So what happens with Reagan, what happened with Ford inaugurates it, Reagan signs Martin Luther King MLK law and holiday into law, Barack Obama becomes the kind of culmination of that, right? Even so much so he can tell the story of the March on Washington in such a way that, you know, affirms the possibility of American life. We lost our way with Black Power, but no, this is what we're doing. The MAGA folk don't even want that to be a part of the story. Mm-hmm. But what we see in this moment is this absorption of Black history as an affirmation of the inherent goodness of the country. So our story is blunted. Mm-hmm. It doesn't provide a critique, right? Instead, the country can tell our story and pat itself on the back. Look at you. Mm-hmm. Look at me.
Exceptionalism.
Look how far we've come.
Yep.
Look how decent we are. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. And then, in the blink of an eye, we find ourselves here.
You call this book an elegy. It's pitched in the note of the blues. But I want to know why the blues is the right form of the story of America at this 250th anniversary.
America has to grow up. It can no longer hide in its adolescence. You know, when grown folk act like kids, they're monstrous, more often than not. And so it keeps telling itself this story that affirms its innocence. And what the blues does, the blues, right, takes you to the heart of the problem. B.B. King's Nobody Loves You But My Mother, and she can be jiving too. It offers a tragic sense of the world, right? We don't have to be all angels, right? The devil and the angel is in us. So all we need to do is to look in the mirror. So we need to grow up, because if you don't grow up, you can bomb Iran and then tell somebody else to fix it. If you don't grow up, you can do all of this evil in these detention centers, in these black sites, and not hold anybody responsible, right? You can become complicit with evil because you are by definition innocent. So the country has to sing the blues. And you know what? We've deposited it there since we got here.
That's the thing you talk about too, is like, we aren't just a part of history, American history. We are interwoven into the very meaning of what this country is.
It's on our tongue. It's in our food. We have your country. No. We, in the fullness of our diversity, make this place swing. So on July 4th and July 5th, as Trump and J.D. Vance invoke blood and soil, we need to show the full diversity of America. Let's just show our behinds in full glory and claim the country as our own.
Eddie, Glaude, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for this conversation. I would actually venture to say, when you say I do not love this country, actually this book is a love letter to America.
Oh, you got me.
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely.